Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Vizru's walkthrough series. Once again, my name is Ben, here with my co-host Milan. And today we have again Justin Coy, who is a product manager here at Vizru, and he's going to be taking us through the process of how ways a workflow can be called using Vizru. So without further ado, we'll hand it over to Justin. Thank you for joining us, and take it away.
Yeah, hey guys. So I'll discuss various ways of calling workflows within Vizru, and then how we can call workflow outside of Vizru. So some of the ways that we can call workflows within Vizru is from the spreadsheet itself, from forms, data lists, dropping files into a Livespace, whether it be a file upload widget on a dashboard or within a form, through a HTML card, and then through the live cloud. And then we'll get to, at the very end, how we call a workflow outside of Vizru. Okay, so let's get started with the spreadsheet. So if we're going to call a workflow from a spreadsheet, go ahead and locate our spreadsheet and locate a column. Okay, so once our column is selected, we'll go ahead and come down over here to onChange event. And you'll see something here called parameter and a drop-down menu. So this will list all of the workflows available inside the tenant. And let's say that we wanted to select this workflow, task file upload. So this means that anytime the task name changes in any row, this workflow will execute. Right, so if we hit update, right, and if we want to change this task name test to test2 and hit enter, that will trigger this workflow here called task file upload. So that one's pretty simple. Getting into the form, there's a few ways that we can execute workflows within forms. Okay, it's going to be located here in the left-hand section of the form builder. First is reflexive form. So this is used with an init workflow that will allow you to manipulate the contents of a form. So in order for your workflow here to show up in this list, the workflow must have the form rule block that connects to this particular task form. Okay, so that's one way. Another way is to execute a workflow before save. So this allows you to execute a workflow whenever a user saves the form. So the order of operations here is that when a user clicks save in a form, this workflow will first execute, then only the changes will be saved. Okay, after save is very similar, except the order of operations is reversed, right? So the form content is saved, and then your selected workflow will execute. Okay, so this is very useful for building logic around the inputs that a user gives in a form. All right, moving on to the data list. So workflows can be executed inside of a data list by creating an action button. All right, so down here, we'll see that there's an action button section. So suppose that we wanted to be able to delete records. So we'll create a button called delete. We'll give it an alias delete. All right, and then we can choose a workflow to execute once this button is selected. All right, so we have our list of workflows here. By way of example, I'm going to leave this blank, but in a real life scenario, you would want to choose a workflow that would help facilitate deleting tasks from your spreadsheet. So we'll keep it blank and hit create. All right, now we see we have an action button. We can remove it using the trash icon. And we can also give it a nice icon here. So if we're deleting something, maybe we want to use the trash can icon. All right. Second thing to do here is make sure that the row checkbox here is enabled. And this will give us a checkbox against each of the rows inside the data list, which will help us choose records that we want to take action against, which is delete. Okay, so if we update, it didn't save. All right, give me 1 second. Okay, now we see that against each row, we have a checkbox and our button here, delete. So what'll happen if we select these two and hit delete? If we had a workflow set up to this button, then these two records would go to the workflow and disappear from the list automatically if the data list is set to real-time update. Okay, so that's how we can call a workflow within a data list. All right, so dropping a file into a Livespace. So whenever a file is uploaded through a Livespace, either through a form or an HTML card embedded in a dashboard, every workflow that starts with that get parameter block with the file upload will execute. So if we take a look at what we have in the form, we can select a file and hit save. Okay, and I have a workflow here where my entry block is actually specified upload, right, as the action. So this means that anytime a file is uploaded, any workflow that starts with this get parameters and the upload action will execute. So that's another way to execute a workflow. Let's talk about cards now. How do you execute a workflow from within a card? All right, so we'll create a new card here. And we'll call it execute workflow. And to help with this, let's go ahead and choose a simple card with a button. So this one looks nice. We'll copy this, copy the contents in, and we'll go ahead and save. Okay, so now what we want to do is when we click subscribe, we want to be able to trigger a workflow. So inside the UI builder, if we go to components, at the very bottom, this workflow button here will give an example on how to call a workflow from a button inside a card. So a couple things you'll notice is the class has something called workflow action button. So we'll want to grab that class.
So you said this workflow button, this is a button that goes on the card in order to call the workflow, correct?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
So the goal is once we click subscribe, then we'd want some workflow to execute.
Okay, got it. Got it. Just want to make sure I was following that kind of connection. That makes sense.
All right, so in the HTML, we can see we have this button, subscribe, there's our button. Okay, so now what we want to do is inside the class, we'll go ahead and add that workflow action button. Okay, and then the second thing we're gonna need is the workflow ID. That is, what workflow do you want to trigger once this button is clicked? So we'll grab that, add that here. So that WID, that stands for workflow ID. And all we have to do here is change this to our workflow shortcode. So I've created a workflow here. simple workflow with one block. And we're going to want to get the shortcode, which is located in the settings section, the very right. All we have to do is click and it's automatically copied to our keyboard. We'll come back here and then we'll go ahead and replace that with our shortcode. Okay. So we'll save this and we'll go ahead and add that card to our dashboard. Okay, so if we click this button, we'll see. Okay, so first let's enable the log to see the execution. So if we click it again, come back, and look at that, just executed this workflow from our task management app. So that's yet another way to execute a workflow from within a card. Another way is using Live Cloud. So what I've done is I set up a function here called call workflow. And it's going to be a post. And the base URL will be the actual URL of the workflow itself, except notice that if we go to a workflow, there's a couple things that need to change. We have this pound symbol and debugger. So all I did was get rid of that pound symbol in the URL and change debugger to trigger. So that will let the workflow know that it wants to be triggered. Okay, so let's actually go ahead and bring this workflow up. Okay, so our first block is a generic post. We have to make sure this matches with our method here. It's a post. Okay, and then in the output, all I'm going to do is return a variable called test that says hello world. So if we click validate, we can see a couple things. So I passed in inside the body key value pair where string equals hello. So we can see that here. We can also see that that variable I defined at the very end, test is hello world, also shows up. And we also get the log ID of the workflow, right? If we get into that workflow, take a look at the log, we can see I passed in that string called hello, and then it returned hello world. So this is another way to call a workflow. What you can also do is, let's say that Ben and Milan have different tenants, Ben at Vizru.com and Milan at Vizru.com. Let's say that Ben wanted to call a workflow from Milan's Livespace or Milan's tenant. So if we had a tenant called Milan.Vizru.com and this was Ben's tenant, we could actually call a different tenant, right? Call a workflow from a different tenant. And we can also do that too. So essentially what you can have is two instances of Vizru that can talk to each other via Live Cloud. Okay, so another way to call a workflow is from outside of Vizru. And so we'll use Postman for this example. And we'll use the same workflow that we called in the Live Cloud section. So I have that URL handy here. Since this is accepting an incoming post, we'll change get to post. And since I don't require any other parameters inside this function, we'll go ahead and hit send. And remember that workflow I had at the very end, a variable called test that gave an output hello world, and we can see that here in the output itself. So this is yet another way to call a Vizru workflow.
All right, well, thanks again to Justin for walking us through the ways a workflow could be called today. That's all for Milan and I, and so we'll see you next time on the Vizru walkthrough series. Thank you.